Okay, so I'm still working with the same scene here. Now we're going to start to get our hands dirty with Radiance Particles. Okay, so I went over all these parameters very quickly, just gave you a brief description on them. I'm going to put these to default settings there. And now what we're going to do is actually start using Irradiance Particles. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to close that. I'm going to clear out my script editor here. Okay, I'm going to have to turn Rebuild back on. Okay, so there's a couple of methods that we can use for rendering out for Radiance Particles. We can render out with interpolation, like I said earlier, which renders out much faster. Or we can render out the brute force method without interpolation, which renders pretty nice, but takes longer to render. So let me show you how to render out the brute force method first, and then we'll work with the other method later. I'm going to switch interpolation to never. So this way, it's not going to interpolate, ever. Okay? Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set these settings down because right now we're in the tweaking stage, so I'm going to show you how to tweak this stuff. Let me go ahead and take these rays down to about 64. Okay? And I'm going to go over here to my photon globals here. And actually, let me turn environment off. That's not going to make much of a difference, but I want to just turn it off so it doesn't try to compute any environment rays. We don't have any type of environment set up in our scene, so it's not going to affect our scene. But I just want to turn it off. And over here, we have ourselves our density parameter. It's set to 1. 1 is a high quality setting for a production render, and in most cases it's overkill. Not in all cases, it's actually dependent on your scene, but in this case it's going to be overkill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knock that down to something like 0.1, which is pretty low, but it's still going to emit plenty of importance in our scene. Okay, so with that done, let me just go ahead and do a preview render. Let's have a look at our diagnostics down here. We can see here what we have is 13,632 irradiance particles. Okay, and as you can see, it's actually rendering out pretty fast, much faster than before. See that? So the default settings were in fact overkill, like I mentioned before. So now we're rendering out in, according to the wall clock, just 20 seconds. So you can see how if you know what you're doing, you can reduce your render times dramatically. And the quality of this isn't the best, but it's not horrifying either. We still have our indirect illumination. As you can see, we don't have any color splotching. Let's switch the camera view here to this one. You can see how fast it emitted the importance. The reason it did that so fast is because, as you can see in the script editor, we're only firing off 13,632 importance here are being taken into account by Radiance Particles. That's because we lowered this setting down to 0.1. If we go ahead and increase that back to 1, now you're going to see our importance take a little bit longer to render. Actually, they take a lot longer to render than before. So there they go. There's our importance shooting into our scene, and when it finishes emitting the importance, we're going to get to see here in the script editor how many importance were fired. Now, before we fired off about 13,000 importance. Now we're firing off, as you can see here, 136,000 importance. So more than 100,000 importance as opposed to 30,000 importance before. Okay, so that's something that's very, very important to make note of and understand, that the number of importance fired into the scene dramatically affects your render time. So our render time went from 20 seconds and is now about 40 seconds. So you can see our render time doubled when we increased the density to 1. So you can imagine if I went crazy and decided to use a density of say 5. Look how slow our importance are going now. And we're probably going to have a massive amount of importance, probably a few million probably. And the truth is we don't need a few million. In most cases, we don't even need a density of 1. We can actually get away with a lot less. For most scenes, you can get away with less than 100,000 importance, believe it or not. If you know what you're doing and you tweak this right, you can get away with that little bit number of importance. And if you can do that and get a high quality render, you can create an irradiance particle map very quickly in just minutes and start doing your architectural visualization animation. Okay, so you can see it's rendering very fast with no interpolation. Now, if you remember, I did say that interpolation speeds up the render time. So you're probably wondering, wait a minute, if I don't use interpolation, I get fast renders. However, you have to realize one thing. Okay, we haven't started using indirect passes, and our rays are now set at 64. This obviously is not good for a production render, so we need to increase the number of rays. So to get ourselves a really good render, we're going to have to increase our rays to something like, say, let's try 200 and see what we come up with. Okay, and the density is much too high. I'm going to go with density of about 0.1, which is, let's see how many importons that gives me about 13,000 and a half, which is a pretty decent amount. It's not the best amount, but it's pretty decent to get ourselves a pretty decent render here. You can see the render time is now slowing down pretty dramatically. We're not getting those 20-second or 30-second renders anymore. Now our renders are taking much longer, and that's because we're using 200 rays. You'll also notice that we got rid of a lot of the artifacting graininess that was here before. That's because we're using many more rays. Before we were using only 64, now we're using 200. So we're using a good number of rays. But 200 is still not good enough for production render, because if you look closely, we still have plenty of artifacting in the scene. I'm just going to let it finish rendering here so that I can see the wall clock, and it's wrapping up. Okay, so render time now increased to 53 seconds, just under 1 minute. So the more we increase these rays, the longer our render times get. They get longer, 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 and longer, and longer. Okay? And the downside to using this brute force method is that every time I change my camera view, the render time is going to be very long. So if it takes, say I increase this to 500 rays and my render takes, I don't know, 5 minutes. Every time I do a render, it's going to take 5 minutes to calculate this irradiance particles. Okay, so it's very important for you to understand. That's the drawback to using the brute force method, or also known as this method here with no interpolation. So it's very important for you to understand that. Okay. All right, so that's going to do it for that raise parameter. What I'm going to do next is lock this render down, and I'm going to increase this indirect passes. I'm going to add one indirect pass. I'm also going to go here to my photon and porton settings. I'm going to increase the diffuse bounces to 2. Okay, so my trace depth, or my diffuse bounces as it's known in XSI, has been increased to 2. Okay, so I'm going to do another render, and I'm keeping my old one here. That's why I locked it down, so I can compare and contrast afterwards. And we can see that we are now emitting 30,000 photons as opposed to about 13,000 from before. And you can see here it's computing indirect passes for radiance particles. Essentially what's going on here is that since we increase the number of indirect passes to 1, okay, the radiance particles has to calculate that indirect pass. That's why you don't want to increase the indirect passes too many times, because the more passes you have, the longer this indirect pass computation phase is going to take. And you can see it's already taken a good amount of time. So the last thing we want to do is have it calculate more than one indirect pass. We don't want it to calculate 5 or 4 indirect passes. To be honest with you, for most intents and purposes, one indirect pass is usually good enough if you're going for speed. If you don't mind the slow render times, go ahead and increase it to 2. But I wouldn't really go past 2, as the difference is not going to be too apparent, and the contribution at the end of the render is not going to be too great. So that's just something to take into consideration there when working with indirect passes with radiance particles. So you can see it's taking a pretty good amount of time here to calculate these this indirect pass here. And we're only doing one indirect pass, by the way. But either way, it's still going a little bit slower. So it's moving along, it's moving along. May feel like it's taking a long time and longer than Final Gathering, but the thing that you have to keep in mind here is that radiance particles are very beneficial and have many, many superior qualities to Final Gathering. It may not be too apparent right now, but by the end of this volume, you'll understand why that is. So here we go, rendering out. That's looking pretty good. You can already start to see that the extra indirect pass is taking effect. If you look at this part of the previous render, it's very dark. There's some color bleeding, but not too much. Over here in the image on the right, we have ourselves a little bit brighter corners here. It looks actually much nicer. Has this nice softer look. Another apparent area is down here underneath this area of the column right here on the top. You can see in the left image, the image without any type of indirect passes is very dark right there, very pronounced. The image on the right is still darker there, but it looks more realistic. We have more light bouncing around in there, and it simply looks fantastic. So adding indirect passes gives you these nicer, brighter, more realistic, and just more pleasing renders, at least in my opinion. Okay, but you can see that adding the indirect pass increased the render time dramatically. Now it's taking over 2.5 minutes to render this stuff out. So 2 minutes and 41 seconds. The last render we did, this one here, I believe, was just under a minute, was about 53 seconds. And this one is now 2 minutes, 41 seconds. So our render time has almost tripled. Okay? And that's a pretty big factor. A factor of 3, triple, is a pretty big factor. So imagine if you were doing a render that takes 1 hour to render. If now it takes you 3 times as long to render, you're looking at 3-hour renders. Okay, so it's very important to understand that indirect passes. That's why you don't want to go too crazy with this and add too many of those. Okay, so 1 is usually more than enough. Okay, so let me take that indirect pass down just to get rid of it for the moment, just so we render a little bit faster. Okay, so now that you're starting to get the idea of how these parameters work together, let me just recap real quick. Interpolation's off. So the main thing that's going to control my quality with interpolation turned off is the number of rays. If I use very little rays, like 2 for example, and I go ahead and render this out, it's going to render out very, very fast, as you can see. But we're going to have, of course, unacceptable artifacting all over the place. This is because only 2 rays are being shot for every Irradiance Particles, or every shading point. Okay, and this obviously is not good enough at all. This is no good, even though it rendered in 16 seconds. But that's no good. So in order to get this brute force method with no interpolation to look good, the main parameter you have to concern yourself with is the rays parameter, and over here in the importans, the density parameter. Okay, so you want to use enough importans to get yourself a good solution, but you also have to use a good number of rays. Okay, so with importans we're using 0.1 right now, which is giving us about 13,000 importans, which actually isn't a lot. So let's increase it to 0.5. Let me close that PPG I opened there. Okay, I'm going to still use 2 rays, and I'm going to refresh this, and it's emitting the importans there. I increased the importans to 0.5, 0.5 there, and in a moment we'll get to see how many importans we're firing out in this scene. And that's okay, that's a lot, 135,400. If we're using that many importans, it's going to increase our render time dramatically. As you can see here, our render time didn't increase too bad, but that's because we're not shooting enough rays. See, right now our render time is 31 seconds, but as soon as we increase the rays parameter, that render time is going to increase by a lot. So I want to go back here, and I'm going to take this back down to 0.1. Okay, I'm going to refresh the render there, and now we're shooting out 30,000 importans, 30,260 to be exact, but 30,000 is actually going to work out very, very well. Okay, so I'm going to stick with 30,000. So a value of 0.1. Default setting is 1. I set it down to 1/10 of that. I set it down to 0.1, which is going to work out just fine. Then I'll go back here and I'll increase the number of rays, and that render took 16 seconds, by the way. Now, to get ourselves a nice render, we're going to need a lot of rays. Now, if we use 200 rays like we saw before, we're not going to get ourselves a great render. We're going to have to use something like 1,000 rays. But let's try to get away with 500. I think 500 might actually work out pretty well. So let's refresh. It's emitting the importans. Importon emission is very, very fast. It already optimized the Radiance Particles. It happened lightning fast. But then this stage here, this ray tracing stage, is where it's going to take its time, because now is when it's sampling those 500 rays for those 30,000 importans. Okay, so the more importans you have, the more calculations are going to be made, because we're doing 500 rays for all of those importans. So if we've got 100,000 importans, 500 rays is going to slow us down a lot, because we're having to sample 500 rays for 100,000 importans. In this case, we're only using 30,000 importans, which is a little bit more optimized. It's not the highest and most ideal number of importans, but as you can see from the image that's rendering already, 30,000 importans is good enough. So the quality difference between 30,000 importans and 100,000 importans is not a huge difference in terms of quality. The naked eye won't be able to tell, hey, this guy used 30,000 importans instead of 100,000, so his render doesn't look that good. No one's going to say that because no one's going to know the difference. Only you are, or whoever worked on the scene. So it's good to use the least amount of importans possible that you can get away with. And in this case, 30,260 importans just happens to be a good enough number of importans to get away with a good look. Okay, and 500 rays is actually rendering out pretty good. As you can see, this solution is very, very nice. Now, we're not using any indirect passes. Very important to keep note of that. As soon as I increase these passes to 1 or higher, my render times are going to increase very, very moderately, okay, if not dramatically. So that's something to make a note of. So there you go. It's rendering pretty good. I'm just going to pause the video and let it finish rendering. We'll check the wall clock at the end. Okay, so the render finished, and if you check the wall clock down here, you notice that the render took 2 minutes 18 seconds. That's compared to 11.5 minutes from our first render using the default settings with interpolation. So here's the thing. When you render with interpolation, it's supposed to be much faster than rendering like this, the brute force method with no interpolation. Yet we were able to render out an image that looks just as good, if not better, than the interpolated image we did with the default settings, and we were able to do it in 2 minutes 18 seconds as opposed to 11.5 minutes that we did when we rendered out the default render settings in XSI. So that's what I was talking about earlier. If you know what you're doing and you know how to tweak the parameters, you can squeeze as much juice as you can out of it. Okay, so in this case, I'd say that I squeezed out a lot of juice. I used 500 rays, got myself a really good result. My lighting looks very, very nice. We're not using any indirect passes, unfortunately, but we could. That's going to increase render time, though. And we did all of this using no interpolation, so we used a slow method, and in only 2 minutes, 18 seconds. So that is excellent, my friend. Okay, so something else that I want to do here. What I want to do here is show you a neat little trick for rendering out with Radiance Particles using this brute force method with no interpolation very fast. And before I do that, I'm going to create a render that's going to take a very long time to render. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to clear out my script editor down there. Okay, what I'm going to do is come over here. No, my important settings are just fine. I'm not going to change them. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the number of indirect passes by 1, and I'm going to increase the raise parameter to 1000. So I'm purposely increasing the render time by a lot. But there's not much we can do. If we want a higher quality render and we want to use an indirect pass, we have no choice. There's no trick. You have to increase the indirect passes to at least 1 so you can get that extra diffuse bounce. And we have to use a good number of rays to get ourselves a good result. Okay? And then over here, of course, we already figured that 0.1 for density is good, which comes out to roughly 30,000 importans. And we're using 2 diffuse bounces there for the importans, which is good enough for the scene. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to render this out based on these settings. And this render is actually going to be very slow for 2 main reasons. One, I doubled the amount of rays from 500 to 1000, and I increased the indirect passes from 0 to 1. That's going to increase our render time by a very good amount. Okay, so with that said, let me go ahead and refresh this. So it already emitted the importans. That was the fastest part. Only 30,000 importans, as we can see down here. And now it's computing the indirect passes for the Irradiance particles. And if you remember, this parameter up here is the indirect passes. Okay, so it's doing that. Notice how slow it goes. Why is it going so slow? Well, the reason it's going so slow is because we're using 1000 rays. We need 1000 rays for this to look good. The problem is that the indirect pass is being sampled with 1000 rays. So the higher your rays value, the longer your render is going to take if you're using indirect passes. If we were using a small number of rays, like say 20, 50, or even 100, we would render much faster even if we're using an indirect pass, simply because there's less rays to have to compute for all of the importants. Okay, so this is taking a very long time. Now I'm not going to sit here and have you watch this. I'm going to pause the video and jump forward in time, and we're going to skip this until the render's finished, and then I'm going to show you the final wall clock so you can see how long this took to render, which is going to be a pretty good amount of time. So just hang in there. Okay, so we finished rendering here. This looks pretty good. The quality is pretty good. It looks pretty similar to 500 rays, to be honest with you, but looks pretty good nonetheless. And our indirect pass makes the lighting look much nicer in this render. Okay. Now the wall clock was 12 minutes 12 seconds, which still ain't that bad, but we can actually reduce that render time down by a very good amount. Okay. So 12 minutes 12 seconds. What I'm going to do is come down here in the script editor, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in render 1, and I'm going to take and I'm going to copy that wall clock time, and I'm going to paste it down there. And then what I'm going to do is skip another line, type in render 2, and the only reason I'm doing this is just to make an actual record of our render times here. So our first render time was 12 minutes 12 seconds. Okay, very important to keep that in mind. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to end this video because it's been going long enough, but in the next video I'm going to pick up exactly where I left off here, because I want to show you a cool little trick that we can do to speed up this render time pretty dramatically. And I'm talking about by speeding the render time by a factor of 2 or even 3 times, which is fantastic. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video.